The gentle creak of my rocking chair filled the quiet afternoon as I traced my fingers over the old photo album in my lap. 35 years of teaching children had taught me patience, but nothing had prepared me for the betrayal that would come from my own flesh and blood. I'm Rose Anderson, and this is my story of trust, heartbreak, and an unexpected second chapter in life. Robert and I had always dreamed of leaving something meaningful for our grandchildren. "Family is everything, Rosie," he would say, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he planned our future. We had lived modestly, saving every penny we could, building what we thought would be a legacy of love and security. But 5 years ago, God called Robert home suddenly, leaving me to navigate this world alone, or so I thought. Among our 3 grandchildren, Thomas had always been special. From the moment he was born, those bright blue eyes seemed to hold a spark of Robert's entrepreneurial spirit. Weekend after weekend, he filled our home with laughter, building blanket forts in the living room and reading stories with me until he dozed off. I still remember him at 7, sitting at Robert's desk, pretending to be a businessman just like his grandfather. "One day, Grandma Rose," he'd declare with childish determination, "I'm going to make you and Grandpa proud." Those memories kept me warm during the lonely nights after Robert passed. Our modest home felt emptier, but Thomas's visits continued. He'd grown into a striking young man, with an MBA from a prestigious university and a startup company that seemed to be taking off. When he brought Victoria home to meet me, my heart soared. She was a successful lawyer with a kind smile, and the way Thomas looked at her reminded me of how Robert used to gaze at me. But life has a way of hiding storms behind the brightest rainbows. I should have noticed the shadows under Thomas's eyes growing darker, the way his phone would buzz incessantly during our Sunday dinners, how his hands would tremble slightly when business came up in conversation. Instead, I saw what I wanted to see, my beloved grandson following in his grandfather's footsteps. That Tuesday afternoon changed everything. Thomas arrived unannounced, his usually immaculate suit slightly wrinkled, his confidence replaced with an unfamiliar desperation. "Grandma Rose," he said, perching on the edge of Robert's old armchair, "I need to tell you about an amazing business opportunity." As he spoke about market trends and investment potential, I heard Robert's voice in my head. Family is everything. What I didn't hear were the warning bells that should have been ringing. I sat there, in the same rocking chair where I'd nursed him through childhood fevers and teenage heartbreaks, as my grandson wove a tale of technological innovation and guaranteed returns. The amount he needed, $200,000, made my breath catch, but the way he spoke about preserving Robert's legacy, about making his grandfather proud, melted my hesitation like spring snow. The inheritance Robert had left me was meant for my twilight years, carefully invested and preserved. But as Thomas clutched my hands, his eyes brimming with tears of what I thought was passion for his dreams, I remembered all the times Robert had helped young entrepreneurs get their start. "Sometimes, Rose," he'd say, "you have to risk a little to help someone achieve a lot." Looking at our grandson, I saw the reflection of my late husband's generosity and vision. How could I say no to family? Eleanor, my dearest friend, caught me after church that Sunday. "Rose," she said, her voice heavy with concern, "are you sure about this investment? Something doesn't feel right." But I brushed off her worries with a practiced smile. After all, this was Thomas, the little boy who'd helped me tend my garden, who'd fixed my computer countless times, who'd promised his grandfather he'd always take care of me. What I didn't realize then was that the garden of trust I'd spent a lifetime cultivating was about to be uprooted by the very hands I'd taught to plant seeds. My hands trembled as I opened the thick manila envelope containing the investment documents. The papers inside looked impressive, glossy brochures filled with charts and graphs, projections that promised returns that seemed too good to be true. But Thomas had an answer for every question, his responses practiced and smooth, like a dance he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. "The technology sector is booming, Grandma," he'd explain, pointing to colorful diagrams. With your investment, we'll be able to scale up operations immediately." His words carried the same confidence that Robert had shown in his business dealings, but something in Thomas's eyes seemed different, a flicker of desperation that I chose to ignore. The next few weeks passed in a blur of signatures and bank visits. Each time I voiced a concern, Thomas would remind me of his grandfather's legacy. "Remember how Grandpa always said to invest in family?" he'd say, his voice thick with emotion. "This is our chance to make his dreams come true." Those words were keys to a lock I didn't even know I had around my heart. Victoria's behavior began to change. Her warm smiles turned hesitant, and she stopped coming to our weekly Sunday dinners. When I called to check on her, her responses were clipped, guarded. "Things are just busy at the firm," she'd say, but I could hear the strain in her voice. One evening, I overheard her arguing with Thomas on the phone outside my house. "You can't keep doing this," she hissed. "She trusts you." When I asked Thomas about it later, he dismissed it as work stress, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Eleanor tried to warn me again. She'd heard rumors through her son, who worked in finance. "Rose, honey, have you checked the business registration, the financial statements?" But I was already in too deep, my judgment clouded by memories of the little boy who used to fall asleep in my lap during thunderstorms. "He's family," I told her firmly, though my voice wavered. Family doesn't betray family. The first real crack in my certainty came when Mrs. Thompson, my longtime bank manager, pulled me aside during another withdrawal. Her face was etched with concern as she showed me a series of transactions that didn't make sense. "These withdrawals," she said gently, "they're being made at Casino ATMs." I defended Thomas immediately, explaining about business meetings and client dinners. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Then came the missed calls, the canceled visits, the vague updates about temporary market setbacks. Thomas's appearance began to deteriorate. His crisp suits replaced by rumpled clothes, dark circles under his eyes growing deeper. He lost weight, his once healthy frame becoming gaunt. When he did visit, his eyes would dart to his phone constantly, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. The final blow came on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Victoria arrived at my door, mascara streaked down her face. "I can't be part of this anymore," she sobbed, placing her engagement ring on my coffee table. "Thomas has a gambling addiction, Rose." "The startup, it's all gone. Everything's gone." She pulled out her phone, showing me statement after statement, casino charges, online betting sites, massive debts hidden under the guise of business expenses. As the truth washed over me, I sank into Robert's old armchair, my legs no longer able to support me. The beautiful dreams Thomas had sold me, the legacy we were supposed to be building, it had all been a house of cards. And now, watching it collapse around me, I realized that my grandson hadn't just taken my money, he'd gambled away something far more precious, the trust that had been the foundation of our family for generations. The following days felt like walking through thick fog. I'd sit in my kitchen, staring at the bills piling up on the counter, medical expenses, property taxes, utilities, all previously manageable with Robert's careful planning, now looming like mountains I couldn't climb. The $200,000 that had represented my security, my independence, had vanished into the black hole of Thomas's addiction. Sarah, my daughter, was livid when she discovered the full extent of what had happened. "How could you be so naive, Mom?" she demanded, pacing my living room. "That was your retirement, your safety net." Her words stung, but not as much as the tears I saw in her eyes. She was right. I had been naive, foolishly believing that love could protect me from deception. The shame was the hardest part to bear. Each Sunday at church, I could feel the whispers following me, see the pitying glances from people who'd known me for decades. Eleanor tried to shield me from the worst of it, but news travels fast in small communities. "Did you hear about Rose Anderson's grandson? Gambling addiction has took everything, poor dear." The words echoed in the church halls like a cruel chorus. My doctor noticed the toll it was taking. My blood pressure had spiked, and the stress was affecting my sleep. "Mrs. Anderson," he said gently during a checkup, "you need to consider your own well-being now." But how could I focus on my health when my world was crumbling? The house Robert and I had shared for 40 years, the home where we'd raised our children, celebrated countless Christmases, built a lifetime of memories, might have to be sold. The final blow came when I learned that Thomas had been lying about everything from the start. There had never been a real business, no technology startup, no investment opportunity. Just a desperate young man feeding an addiction that had consumed him like a wildfire. The professional business cards, the glossy brochures, the impressive presentations, all elaborate props in a performance designed to exploit my trust. Victoria came to see me one last time before leaving town. She sat with me in my garden, among the roses Robert and I had planted together. "I tried to stop him, Rose," she whispered, her hands twisting in her lap. "But every time I threatened to tell you he'd promised to get help, to make things right. I was weak and I should have told you sooner." I held her hand as she cried. This young woman who had almost been my granddaughter-in-law, both of us victims of different kinds of heartbreak. The police suggested pressing charges, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. "He's still my grandson," I told the sympathetic officer who took my statement. "He's sick. He needs help more than punishment." But my forgiveness didn't extend to enabling anymore. When Thomas finally called, his voice breaking with remorse and promises to repay everything, I found strength I didn't know I had. "I love you," I told him. "But love without boundaries isn't really love at all." Late one night, unable to sleep, I found myself in Robert's study, surrounded by the remnants of our shared life. A note fell from one of his old business journals, a quote he'd written years ago. "The measure of a person isn't in never falling, but in how they rise after the fall." As I traced his familiar handwriting, something shifted inside me. I'd been knocked down, yes, but Rose Anderson wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. The first time I had to skip my heart medication, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the orange bottle with its $200 price tag. The choice between medicine and keeping the lights on shouldn't be one anyone has to make, especially not at 70. The irony wasn't lost on me. After spending my life teaching children to make good choices, here I was, facing impossible ones of my own. My routine became a careful dance of necessity versus want. I canceled my newspaper subscription, let my garden wither to save on water, and learned to navigate the senior discount days at every grocery store in town. The thermostat stayed low in winter and high in summer, and I pretended not to notice when Eleanor secretly left casseroles in my fridge. Pride is a luxury that poverty quickly strips away. The real estate agent's business card sat on my counter for weeks, growing dog-eared from all the times I'd picked it up and put it down. Selling the house felt like admitting defeat, like erasing Robert's presence from my life. Every room held memories. The kitchen where we'd dance while doing dishes, the stairs where we'd marked our grandchildren's heights, the bedroom where I'd held his hand for the last time. How do you put a price tag on 40 years of love? Sarah tried to convince me to move in with her family. "Mom, be practical," she'd plead. "The house is too big for you anyway." But her eyes couldn't meet mine when she said it. We both knew her spare room was directly across from Thomas's old bedroom, now empty since he'd moved back home to start his recovery program. The thought of daily reminders of our family's fracture was more than either of us could bear. One Sunday, I arrived at church to find my usual pew occupied. As I stood there, uncertain, I heard Mrs. Peterson whisper to her daughter, "That's the one who lost everything to her gambling grandson. Bless her heart." The words hit me like physical blows. I turned and walked out, my heels clicking against the marble floor in an echoing reminder of my shame. For the first time in 50 years, I missed a Sunday service. That afternoon, I sat in Robert's study, surrounded by the books and papers I'd been avoiding since the truth about Thomas came out. A layer of dust had settled over everything, like the fog that seemed to cloud my mind these days. I opened his desk drawer and found the retirement plans we'd made together. Cruise brochures, travel guides, Dreams we'd saved for that would never come true now. The computer Thomas had given me for Christmas sat dark and silent in the corner. I'd stopped turning it on weeks ago, tired of seeing the online banking numbers that only went down. Besides, what was the point? At my age, what could I possibly do to rebuild everything I'd lost? The world had changed so much. Technology, social media, digital everything. I was a relic, useful only for cautionary tales about trusting too much. Eleanor found me there, still sitting in the growing darkness. She didn't bother with the usual platitudes about God's plan or silver linings. Instead, she pulled up another chair and sat with me in silence. Finally, she spoke. Remember when the school board wanted to replace all the teachers with computers back in '95? You learned every program they threw at you, just to prove technology could never replace the human touch. I looked at her, this friend who'd stood by me through Robert's death, through Thomas's betrayal, through everything. That was different, I said. I was younger then. I had something to prove. She reached over and turned on the computer, its blue light filling the dark room. So prove something now, she said simply. Prove that Rose Anderson doesn't go down without a fight. The screen came to life, and with it, a small spark inside me that felt surprisingly like hope. Or maybe it was anger. At this point, either emotion was better than the numbness I'd been living with. I thought about all my former students who now live their lives through screens and apps. I thought about other grandmothers out there, vulnerable to the same betrayal I'd suffered. Most of all, I thought about Robert's voice in my head. The measure of a person isn't in never falling. I straightened my spine, feeling each of my 70 years, but also feeling the weight of every challenge I'd ever overcome. Eleanor, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. Teach me about this TikTok thing everyone keeps talking about. Learning TikTok at 70 was like trying to learn a new language while blindfolded. My first video was a disaster, shaky footage of me explaining how to spot financial scams, filmed in my dimly lit living room. Eleanor's grandson, Max, watched it with the kind of patience only a 16-year-old tech expert could muster. "Mrs. A," he said, trying not to smile, "let's talk about lighting and camera angles." What started as a desperate attempt to warn others about elder fraud slowly transformed into something more. Max taught me about ring lights and microphone settings, while Eleanor helped me organize my thoughts into clear, engaging messages. Wisdom from Rose's garden became my signature opener, a nod to the actual garden I'd neglected during my depression. Today, we're planting seeds of financial awareness, I'd say, and somehow people started listening. The comments began trickling in. My grandmother almost fell for the same scam. "Thank you for being so honest about your story. You remind me of my mom. I'm calling her right now." Each notification became a small victory, a reminder that my pain could serve a purpose. I started sharing more than just warnings. I talked about resilience, about starting over at 70, about finding strength in vulnerability. Sarah was skeptical at first. "Mom, are you sure about putting yourself out there like this?" she asked, concern etched on her face. But when my follower count hit 10,000, then 50,000, even she had to admit something remarkable was happening. Local news picked up the story. Grandmother turns financial tragedy into social media triumph. The irony wasn't lost on me. Technology, which had played a role in my grandson's deception, was now becoming my tool for healing. The real breakthrough came when I received an email from a financial literacy organization for seniors. They wanted me to speak at their conference, not just about being a victim, but about becoming an advocate. The night before my speech, I stood in front of my mirror, practicing words I never thought I'd say. My name is Rose Anderson, and my story isn't about what I lost, but what I found. My following grew, and with it came opportunities I'd never imagined. Companies specializing in elder fraud prevention asked me to review their materials. Banks invited me to conduct workshops. My simple TikTok account evolved into a full-fledged platform for senior empowerment. The income wasn't huge, but it was enough to keep my house, to afford my medications, to start rebuilding the safety net I'd lost. Eleanor watched it all with a knowing smile. "You're not just teaching them about fraud," she said one afternoon as we reviewed comments together. "You're teaching them about resilience." She was right. Each video, each workshop, each speaking engagement was a step further from victim and closer to victor. The garden of trust I thought Thomas had destroyed was blooming again, but this time with stronger roots and sharper thorns. One evening, as I finished recording a video about the importance of financial boundaries, I caught my reflection in the ring light's glow. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same one who had sat broken in Robert's study months ago. She was stronger, wiser, with a spark in her eyes that spoke not of past betrayals but of future possibilities. "Remember, my dears," I said to my growing online family, "it's never too late to rewrite your story." And for the first time in a long time, I truly believed those words. Success has a way of drawing attention, both welcome and unwelcome. As my social media presence grew, so did the whispers in our small town. The same people who had pitied me now wanted to know my secret. The irony wasn't lost on me when Mrs. Peterson, who had once whispered about my shame in church, asked me to teach her how to use TikTok. But not all attention was positive. Sarah called one evening, her voice tight with tension. "Mom, Thomas watched your latest video." My heart stuttered at the mention of his name. "He's not doing well." She explained how my grandson now worked as a stock clerk at the local grocery store, living in their basement, attending mandatory gambling addiction meetings. The successful MBA graduate was now bagging groceries and living with his parents at 28. I found myself watching him through my kitchen window some mornings as he walked to work, shoulders hunched against more than just the weather. His designer suits were replaced by the store's red vest, his confident stride now a weary shuffle. Sometimes he'd pause at the corner where my house stood, looking up at the windows before continuing his journey. I'd hold my breath until he passed, torn between the instinct to run out and embrace him and the hard-learned wisdom of maintaining boundaries. The contrast between our lives became a talking point in town. "Did you see Rose Anderson on Channel 5? They'd whisper. Meanwhile, her grandson. The stories would trail off, heavy with unspoken judgment. I wanted to tell them that success and failure aren't permanent states, that both Thomas and I were works in progress, just at different stages of our journeys. My TikTok following hit 1 million on the same day Thomas earned his 6-month sobriety chip. Sarah sent me a photo of the chip, a tentative olive branch in our family's ongoing healing process. That evening, I filmed a video about second chances, careful not to mention Thomas by name, but hoping he'd understand the message was partly for him. Rock bottom, I told my viewers, can become a foundation if you choose to build on it. The invitations kept coming. Television appearances, podcast interviews, speaking engagements. Each one took me further from my quiet life as a retired teacher, while Thomas struggled to rebuild his from scratch. One magazine dubbed me the TikTok grandmother turning trauma into triumph. The headline made me wince. Triumph felt too strong a word for surviving betrayal, too dismissive of the ongoing pain that still colored our family gatherings. Eleanor remained my steadfast compass through it all. "You know," she said during one of our coffee mornings, "your success isn't a punishment for Thomas, it's a lesson." She was right, as usual. Every video I posted, every senior I helped protect from fraud, was both an act of healing and a form of redemption, not just for me, but perhaps for Thomas too. One day, checking my analytics as Max had taught me, I noticed a familiar name among my regular viewers. Thomas watched every video, never commenting but always present. My content about financial security, trust, and rebuilding after betrayal was reaching thousands. But I wondered what those messages meant to the one viewer who had catalyzed it all. Was he learning? Regretting? Healing? The answer came unexpectedly. A letter arrived, hand-delivered to my doorstep. I recognized Thomas's handwriting on the envelope, neater than it had been in years. Inside was his 1-year sobriety chip, along with a note. "Grandma Rose, I watch you change lives every day, including mine. Keep going, love, Thomas." I held the chip in my palm, feeling its weight. Lighter than the money he'd taken, heavier than all my TikTok followers combined. The conference hall buzzed with anticipation. 2 years had passed since that Tuesday afternoon when Thomas first asked for money, and here I was, about to deliver the keynote speech at the National Elder Financial Protection Summit. My TikTok videos had evolved into a movement, my story becoming a catalyst for change in how financial institutions handled elderly accounts. As I adjusted my microphone, I caught a glimpse of Eleanor in the front row, beaming with pride. Sarah sat beside her, and between them was an empty seat, the one I'd reserved for Thomas. He'd promised to come, his first public appearance at one of my events, but minutes before the start, his chair remained vacant. I pushed down my disappointment and focused on the speech I'd prepared. Trust, I began, is like a garden. It needs proper tending, firm boundaries, and sometimes painful pruning. The words flowed easily now, after countless videos and presentations. I shared my story, not just the betrayal but the resurrection that followed. As I spoke about the importance of financial literacy for seniors, a movement at the back of the hall caught my eye. Thomas slipped in quietly, wearing a suit that reminded me of better days. He stood against the wall, tall and sober, watching me with eyes that held both pride and pain. Our gazes met briefly, and in that moment, I felt the weight of everything that had been lost and found between us. But my story isn't just about financial fraud, I continued, my voice stronger. It's about how we rise after falling, how we rebuild after breaking, how we learn to trust again, not blindly, but wisely. The audience hung on every word, but I was speaking to just one person now. Sometimes, the greatest betrayals can lead to unexpected blessings. Sometimes rock bottom is where we find our firmest foundation. After the speech, amidst the applause and congratulations, Thomas approached me. 2 years of recovery had restored his health, but humility had replaced his former arrogance. "Grandma Rose," he said softly, holding out an envelope. Inside was a check, small compared to what he'd taken, but I knew it represented months of savings from his grocery store job. "Keep it," I said, pressing it back into his hands. "Put it toward your education fund." His eyes widened in surprise. "I'm launching a scholarship program," I explained, "for recovering addicts who want to rebuild their lives. You can be my first success story." The tears that spilled down his cheeks were different from the manipulative ones he'd shed in my living room 2 years ago. These were real, raw, healing tears. When he hugged me, I felt the trembling of his shoulders, the weight of remorse and gratitude combined. Later that evening, I posted my final TikTok video from the conference. "Today," I told my millions of followers, "I want to talk about the hardest kind of trust to rebuild, trust in family." The camera captured Thomas in the background, helping Eleanor with her coat, Sarah watching them both with cautious hope. My phone buzzed with a notification. Victoria had liked the video, her first interaction since everything fell apart. Her profile showed she'd found happiness with someone new, but she hadn't forgotten the lessons we'd all learned. Her comment read simply, "Full circle, Rose. You did it." That night, in my kitchen, the same one where I'd once contemplated selling my house, I watered the new plants Thomas had helped me replant in the garden. Robert's voice seemed to whisper with the evening breeze. "Family is everything, Rosie." But now I understood what he'd meant. Family isn't just about blind trust and unconditional love. It's about growth, boundaries, forgiveness, and the courage to rebuild even after the deepest betrayals. As I looked out at my flourishing garden, I saw more than flowers and vegetables. I saw my life's new purpose grown from the ashes of betrayal. My TikTok handle, Wisdom from Rose's Garden, had become more than just a catchphrase. It was a testament to resilience, a beacon for others who needed hope, and proof that even the harshest winters can lead to the most beautiful springs. "Remember," I whispered, practicing for tomorrow's video, "it's never too late to replant your garden. Just make sure to mind the thorns while tending the roses."